What's up, my fellow seekers? So today we're going to do an introduction into the book of Genesis, and the next, 50 or so videos will be about Genesis each chapter. So Genesis is a very controversial book. It has the story of creation, the fall, Noah's flood, the election of Israel. So there's a lot of stuff in it that we're going to have to unpack, and it's used in the New Testament a lot, theologically and even historically. And so all this is not only important for understanding the Old Testament, but the New Testament and today, like where we come from and why we're where we are today. This is how everything starts and how we've gotten where we are today, not to mention the character of God and how he acts in the world, which is also important. That's what we're going to be unpacking in this Bible study. So the title of Genesis comes from the Vulgate, which borrowed or transliterated from the Greek Genesis, meaning origin. Now, the post-biblical Hebrew word or title for the book of Genesis is Bereshith, which is the first word of Genesis, in the beginning, which we'll get into because there's debate on in the beginning or when God created or something like that. This goes along with the traditional Hebrew way of titling books, which is by the beginning phrase or word in the beginning or near the beginning of the book. So composition. In history, there's Occam's razor is kind of important. Occam's razor is more of a philosophical term, but at the same time, it's used in history and everyday life, really. But in history, it's pretty much called less ad hoc, meaning that a theory has less assumptions, and that's basically Occam's razor. If everything being equal, the one with the less amount of entities is the more likely. In history, it's whatever is less ad hoc, has the less assumptions, is more likely, all things being equal. Applying this, we should immediately assume Genesis has one author, unless evidence says otherwise, and I don't think it does, but a lot of people say it does. A lot of scholars, most scholars actually, say that it does. So let's go through some of this evidence. To begin, there's the different names for God. So there's Yahweh, Elohim, there's also El Shaddai and stuff. I don't think they really focus on that. It's usually just Elohim and Yahweh. And then there's the priestly source, which does to give clarification, Yahweh is God's name, and whenever it's Yahweh, then they say that the Yahwist is the one who wrote that part. And then there's Elohim, which is another source who used the term Elohim for God, which it signifies strength. However, this can easily be explained. So, for example, 1 Corinthians, written by Paul, written by one person. It calls Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 1:23, Christ Jesus in 1 Corinthians 2:2, and Lord in 7:10, and more. And so, did 1 Corinthians have 3 different authors? Not really. There's no evidence for that. And so, similarly, why would we assume the same thing here? In fact, in 1 Corinthians, we see the names of Jesus being used strategically. So, like in 1 Corinthians 7:10, he calls him Lord, and at the same time, he's talking about the Lord giving commands. Therefore, I would say the same thing's being done in Genesis. A good example of this would be Genesis 1, which talks about God's creative powers. Obviously, it's about creation. And the author uses the term Elohim, signifying strength. And then we see in Genesis, later on in Genesis, we see Yahweh, which is his personal name whenever he's personally involved with mankind. So that's really what it could be. It's not necessarily saying there has to be different authors because there are different names for God. It could just be the author using different names for God to signify different things according to the different stories. There's also the claim that different writing styles show different authors. However, this is not very convincing either. So the reason, say, Leviticus is different than, say, Genesis is because it's a different genre, not a different author. For example, John Milton, a lot of people know him for his Paradise Lost, but he also wrote, I'm going to butcher this name, but Areopagitica. The former being poetry, Paradise Lost, and the latter being an argument. They're completely different genres. However, same author. Similarly, Genesis and Leviticus could be written by Moses. There's no reason to assume otherwise, or just one author. Or take the Gospel of John. It has very large sections of prose and then a lot of historical narrative. So did it have 2 different authors? No, not that we know of. Matthew starts, but Luke eventually has a very large section on genealogy. Did that part have a priestly source like they say Genesis did, and the rest has a different source? Of course not. It's all one author. It's just what they do. And so similarly, I don't see any reason to conclude that Genesis had to have a different author, or had to have multiple authors if all these other books didn't have to have different authors either. There's also the idea of duplication of stories. Now, this one's interesting to me. Most of these can simply be explained by similar things happening. So, for example, the couple times that Abraham passed his wife off as a sister, we see that in Genesis 12 and 20, and then we see Isaac doing the same thing in Genesis 26. It's very possible that Abraham just did it twice and Isaac did it again. I mean, he got it from his father. That's perfectly reasonable, and it's simpler than saying there was multiple authors. Others require different explanations. For example, Genesis 1 and 2 have different creation accounts. Why is that? A simple explanation is that Genesis 1 is on all creation, while Genesis 2 is day 6. And he's just emphasizing day 6. He's getting more in detail of detail regarding mankind. And there's also the flood narrative, which is very interesting because God says one thing in Genesis 6:9 and another thing in Genesis 7:2. He says that the first one's bring 2 kinds of every animal. The next one is if clean animals bring 7 couples, and then bring two kinds of every unclean animal. The traditional interpretation of this is that God said one thing and then clarified at another time, which is perfectly normal. There's no reason to say he couldn't do that, and so I would just say that's what happened. The only evidence, in my opinion, that's more convincing would be the combination of duplicates in the name of God. So, for example, Genesis 1 uses Elohim, Genesis 2 uses Yahweh Elohim, Lord God. And so, that's a little bit more convincing, but that kind of goes into what I was saying earlier, where basically they're taking the stories and they're using a certain name for God to signify something about God during that story. Same thing with El Shaddai, which I don't remember where it's used in Genesis, but it's used a few times, God Almighty. Usually in terms of blessing or like descendants or power or something like that. And that's basically what's going on there. He's signifying something in that story. Now, why there's a duplicate, like I said, the explanations differ, but the explanation of the names stay the same. Now, those were more of like negative, like just refuting other reasons that others have put forward for it having a different, or multiple authors. This is not to mention the fact that there is no historical evidence that Genesis had multiple authors. Not even one. No one's ever said that. And we've never found a manuscript that had like just the Yahwist or just the Elohist or anything like that. It's always been one. There's no evidence, manuscriptural or historically, that there is. And this is furthermore there's a computer study done by Y.T. Rade, I think, and H. Shore, which has shown that Genesis likely only had one author. It was a computer study. Now, the documentary hypothesis, this is actually, a lot of this one I'm about to say was written in Rade and Shore's Genesis and Authorship Study in Computer-Assisted Statistical Linguistics. Long title. But nonetheless, it was a very good study, and we'll get into that. But a lot of the reasons for rejecting is also found in there, because they obviously don't believe it. So while the documentary hypothesis is caught on fast, it's not without its opponents. The opponents have many critiques, one being already laid out, which is that different names are used to emphasize different attributes of God. The second critique is that if documentaries differ among themselves in contributing a passage to a certain source, how can one take their assertions seriously? This is found in page 6 of their book. Now, that's a good point. So if someone says Genesis 2 is the Elohist, another one says no, it's the priestly, or another one says no, it's the Yahwist. Well, if you can't tell a difference, then why should we say there is a difference? I think that's a pretty fair claim. If you can't even tell, then why should we say there is one? A third problem persists, however. Quote, what is labeled as doublets and contradictions must not be mechanically solved by dissecting, nay, atominizing the text, but should be explained by semantics, hermeneutics, and genuine instead of sham literary criticisms. That's found on page 8 as well on the Rade and Shore's book. As an example, why may one method and yardstick apply in Herodotus and Josephus, where similar lapses can be found, and another method and yardstick in the Hebrew Bible? And no other literary work, not even the New Testament, have critics so diligently and avidly searched for a lack of total agreement between two halves of the same sentence. I think that's a very good point. Like, you look at all these other sources that aren't the Hebrew Bible, and historians don't sit there and like, well, let's dissect this, let's dissect this, let's dissect. There is no dissecting. There's like, well, let's interpret this. And only in like the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, are people actually looking to dissect the text. which is very strange. But another problem persists. The fourth one. Let's see. Quote, what the editor R, redactor, that's the final editor of Genesis, supposedly, did is so unintelligible altogether. As explained by Rade and Shore, quote, how can Wellhausen's, he's the man who championed a documentary hypothesis, or JEPD theory, which is the 4 different authors. How can Wellhausen's followers explain the astonishing fact that the editor worked in one passage so shrewdly that the sources can no longer be untwined, while at another place so slovenly that a German professor living 3 millennia later has no difficulty in discovering the glue that holds the conglomerate together? So there's some parts where scholars are like, we don't know who wrote this, the J or the E source. We just don't know. And other parts, they're like, oh, this was obviously Elohist. This was obviously the Yahwist. And it's like, what he did, if the final redactor who put these sources together and intertwined them, why did he do it so good at these parts and then just really badly at these parts that 3,000 years later, some guy can come around and be like, oh, this is obviously different. That doesn't really make sense. You'd think that he would put it together in a very good way, basically, a very or intelligible way, but they didn't. Now, all this being said, one must be careful in accusing either side of being overly prejudiced, for both sides are equally prejudiced and have motivations for their conclusions. This is a big misconception on atheist part, or secularism in general, that they're like, well, if there's no God involved, then there's no bias. Well, that's not exactly true. The very fact that they don't believe in God is itself a bias of not wanting to believe in God. Now, I'm not saying that even it's a conscious bias. For people can be unconsciously biased. I know I am. I know atheists are. I know Hindus are. Whatever. If we believe something, we are automatically prejudiced and biased for having that opinion. On the virtue of just having that opinion. And that's on both sides. So the Christians can't look at the atheists, but you're just too prejudiced, and the atheists can't look at the Christians, but you're too prejudiced because we're both prejudiced. The advantage done by Rade and Shore and their fellow researchers is that their team was a mixture of different religious alliances. They say, quote, our religious alliances and our personal convictions differ widely from deep commitment to the teaching of the book under review to indifference vis-a-vis them to mere scientific interest in the interdisciplinary scientific undertaking. That would be found on page 10 of their book. And they also never met in flesh. I mean, I guess some of them did, but for the most part, none of them really met. Furthermore, they use a computer analysis in order to neutralize preconceived ideas. This new approach will completely disregard the book's spiritual message and equally leave aside all semantics, matters governed by interpretation, not to mention personal taste. So it's very neutral. The computer doesn't have a bias. It's just a computer. It can't have a bias, obviously. And people can. And so they gave it to the computer and said, what do you think? All this put together seems to suggest that this new approach, interdisciplinary approach, also is quite compelling. So they use a variety of criteria to establish whether or not a language behavior in parts of Genesis would qualify as author-specifying. So basically, language behaviors that are used in the text, they did a criteria to show which are important and which ones are not going to really consider. So for example, they must be countable and accurately counted, preferably by the computer. It's neutral. And it's also just better than humans. We can err. The computer is a lot less likely to do so. Second, they must be so minute and unobtrusive that the author himself cannot be aware of whether he employed a certain linguistic phenomenon or not. To me, this is the most important, because it shows that even the author wasn't trying to show this was one author, and it wasn't trying to show this is multiple authors. It was so minute and unobtrusive that he wouldn't have even been able to tell. Thirdly, they must not depend on subject matter, whether like Noah's flood or God's character or something like that. It doesn't matter. Fourthly, they must not be dictated by inescapable and mandatory rules of grammar, but rather be optional and facultative. Lastly, they must be tested in other writings in which authorship is known. I think that's important too. There was a study done, it's a little bit off topic, it was about the New Testament. What was it? Let's see. So basically, they tested the naming patterns in the Gospels, and they did it by testing the name patterns in the Gospels, Josephus, and modern-day novels. And so they tested it and found that the Gospels are superior in their naming. So basically, that is so unobtrusive Like, you don't, when you're writing a book, you mean, yeah, you have an idea of what the naming pattern of the area would be, but you're not going to get it, like, perfect. But they got it, like, 86% right, which is, like, really good. Even Josephus, writing nonfiction, it only gets it 6%, because he's mostly writing about, like, aristocrats and stuff like that. And so the Gospels came out really well. And the novels, which if the Gospels were novels, they would have fared pretty much the same. Novels came out as like 0.0000000 like 1% basically. In which case it just goes to show that where it's known they're novels, they came out low. Where it's debated, actually it's not really debated. Most scholars will tell you their biographies, the Gospels. But let's say it is debated. It shows that even they got it more right than a novel would, suggesting what actually happened, or what they say happened actually happened. But nonetheless, let's keep going. Now, the authors analyzed 20,504 words, gathering 9 pieces of information from them, most of said information being grammatical. You can find that on page 16 to 17 of their book. This being said, they omitted certain parts of Genesis that have obviously different literary style, like Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. They split Genesis into 3 parts: the prologue, Genesis 1 to 11, the main body, 12 to 36, and the epilogue, 36 to 50. Furthermore, quote, in addition to the grammatical details into which it was analyzed, each word was given a sigla, J, E, or P, denoting the various hypotheses, hypothetical documents. And that pari passu, and on afterthought, another set of 3 sigla was also registered, namely N, whenever a word occurs in the mouth of the narrator, H if in human, and D if in divine's direct speech. They found the only real difference is between narration and direct speech, whether it be divine or human. That was the only real difference, which kind of makes sense, to me at least. They found that J and E, the different hypothetical sources, Yahwist and Elohist, have no real indicators of being separate. Only P was given some consideration, but that was because of subject matter. So J and E have the direct speech and the narration and stuff. P is usually the sacrifices and the genealogies, which are obviously unique. That's just subject matter. Then they said they weren't going to consider that because it's just subject matter. After all the consideration I just said, running the computer analysis, they conclude that, quote, with all due respect to the illustrious documentarians, past and present, there is massive evidence that the pre-biblical triplicity of Genesis, which in their line of thought postulates to have been worked over by a late and gifted editor into a trinity, is actually a unity. To put it more simply, they say, quote, performed in rigorous laboratory conditions in vitro, so to say, they proclaim that Wellhausen's tripartition of Genesis into J, E, and P is of high improbability. So we got just the evidence not being good. We have no historical evidence. We have no manuscript evidence of it being multiple different compilations or multiple different parts being put into a compilation. But then there's a computer analysis showing that it just had one author. To me, that's like the nail in the coffin. There's just no reason to suggest that there was a documentary hypothesis. Now, as for Mosaic authorship, I think that's a little different, because there's no early source that says Moses wrote Genesis. And the New Testament or the Old Testament doesn't actually really say clearly that he wrote Genesis, unlike other books of the Torah where it does say that. That being said, traditionally, Moses has always been said to be the author, like always, in Christian and Jewish tradition, even though it's late. Therefore, due to tradition being Moses, and the lack of any other evidence or any other suggestion anyone else wrote it, I suggest that Moses is the best candidate, though we can't know for sure. All this being said, Exodus is said to be written by Moses, written by Moses according to Jesus. This is Mark 12:26. And Exodus is an obvious sequel to Genesis, just like Joshua is to the Torah. Therefore, Genesis had to be written before Exodus, which was written by Moses in but in like the 15th century BC. If written by Moses, it would date around the same time. If written not by Moses, it could date even before that. Now let's look at some of the themes in Genesis. According to the ESV Study Bible, themes include creation, sin, recreation. This follows from the fact that Genesis starts with creation, obviously, then sin in Genesis 3, which increases into climaxes into Noah's flood, where he kills everybody. And then we see recreation through Noah, and then eventually Abraham, where God wants to save the world again, but in a different way. Victor Hamilton seems to agree, though using different language, for he says Genesis is moving us progressively from generation, chapters 1 to 2, to degeneration, chapters 3 to 11, to regeneration, and 12 to 15. That is in his commentary, the book of Genesis, chapters 1 to 17. It's the first volume on his two books on Genesis. You can see that on page, I think, 24, right? Nope, 11. Yeah, 11. I would add God's faithfulness as a theme. For God creates us, clothes us after we sin, which is a very caring thing to do. That's in Genesis 3:21. Preserves Noah, and then begins to save the world again through Abraham, or Abram at the time. And not just to the world is God faithful and saving Noah and stuff, but to individual people. He is faithful to his promises to Abraham, which are repeated to Isaac and then Jacob. And then he's faithful to Joseph. He is faithful to Noah and preserves him and his family. So yeah, I would say that it's pretty clear that a theme is God's faithfulness. Another overarching theme would be God is the God who blesses. He initially blesses mankind and all animals in Genesis 1. And then we see in Genesis 9, and then with Abraham, then those promises are repeated to Isaac and Jacob. We see that in Wenham's commentary, Gordon Wenham, Genesis 1 through 15, page 24. He kind of puts that together too. Now, putting those two things together, plus blessing and faithfulness, I would say that we see that God is love. Therefore, we can summarize one of the chief themes of Genesis, apart from sin, degeneration to recreation. I would say that another chief theme would be of Genesis is God's love. Now, Victor Hamilton also agrees with various scholars like Von Rad that the overarching theme, at least for the patriarchal history, which is Genesis 12 to 50, they kind of split into two, we'll get into that, is divine promise, which kind of goes with what I was saying earlier with blessing. They kind of go hand in hand. Now, he continues to talk about how God chose them and protects them despite all their faults. That be Abraham and Noah and all these other people. For, quote, they are not chosen because they are good. They are chosen because of God's sovereign will. Even when they are guilty of highly unethical behavior, God remains true to his promise. I think that's good for me and you because we're not perfect either. And yet God is good, and he's faithful, and he's perfect, so he'll be faithful to us. And that was on page 43 of Victor Hamilton's commentary. Following Hamilton splitting Genesis 1 to 11 and Genesis 12 to 50, I would say that the primeval history has the theme of God's holiness, for he makes everything good and blesses, but then punishes when all his creation goes astray. Another would be mankind's authority, for God made us with authority of the earth, and then when mankind fell, everything fell. And when God punished us, he punished everything in the flood. He killed everything. We were the chief creation in the authority of earth, and just like whenever a kingdom falls, when the king falls, similarly, whenever we fell, everything fell because we were in charge. Now, what's interesting is that Hamilton, along with other scholars, separates Genesis into two parts: the primeval history and then the patriarchal history. While it may make sense at first glance, considering its different contents, Genesis 1 to 11 being history of the earth, and then 12 to 50 being Israel's history, Gordon Wenham makes a good point in saying that the primeval history is also essentially preparatory in function and puts the patriarchs in their cosmic context. So it's kind of like what Rade and Shore did. They put it as a prologue. I would kind of agree with, in a sense, it's a prologue, and that it's giving the necessary information for the rest of the book, which is way longer. Now, he goes on to explain that the God who called Abraham was no local deity, which is what they all believed back then, but the creator of the whole universe. The succession of catastrophes that befell humanity prior to Abraham's call shows just why the election of Abraham and in him Israel was necessary. Therefore, I don't see the split in Genesis being very necessary, though understandable due to the different context. I don't think it matters either way anyway. Now let's look at the historicity. This is a big debate. In terms of historical accuracy, quote, J, the final redactor of Genesis, rests on much older traditions that reflect accurately the situations in the early 2nd millennium BC. The names of the patriarchs are typical of this period. The legal customs, especially in area of family law, reflect the practice of the 2nd millennium. The religious outlook and practices of the patriarchs fit this period too. So although J, the final redactor, was regarded as a relatively late composition, nearly 1,000 years after the event it describes, it is surprisingly reliable where it can be checked. That is Gordon Wenham's commentary. I think that's 43, page 43, but it's in the introduction. Let's see. Furthermore, there are stories like Genesis in Genesis that are unlikely to be invented later, like exilic or post-exilic time, as being whenever the Jews went into exile into Babylon and when they came back. For example, Abraham marrying his half-sister, that was explicitly forbidden by the law. They wouldn't really make that up. Or the tolerant attitude towards Gentiles. Their attitude towards Gentiles changed drastically during that time period for obvious reasons. They were being mistreated by the Gentiles. These points, plus the fact that most of Genesis is treated as true by later authors, suggest that the contents of Genesis did happen. Now, how about Genesis 1:9, how it resembles Mesopotamian myths? Now, I know William and Craig wrote The Historical Adam. That's a book. I haven't read it yet. It's on I plan to, but it's on my list. I haven't really done it yet, though. So I'm going to kind of address that here the best I can. Well, there's several points to make. Firstly, there are some similarities, but the differences vast outweigh the similarities. So, for example, monotheism versus polytheism, that's the most obvious. God's character, mankind's character, and even the various events mentioned in them. So, for example, in the Enuma Elish, which I think is the Babylonian tale of creation, has the creation of the heaven and the earth being the result of a god named Tiamat being sliced in half by Marduk and then separated, and part of it, or one half became the earth, the other half became the heavens. That doesn't sound like Genesis. So saying that there's some borrowing here doesn't really make sense. Nonetheless, let's keep going. Secondly, Adam, Abel, and Noah are all treated as people who actually existed by other authors, including Paul and Jesus. Suggesting they did exist, and what was written about them did happen. Lastly, scientific evidence that is relatively well known shows that the Y chromosomes that men have today came from one man, and all mitochondrial DNA that women have today came from one woman. This is why they're dubbed Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. There's also the evidence of creation. We'll get into that a little bit in the next video and subsequent shorts or whatever. Thus, for these reasons, it would be wise to take Genesis 1 to 11 or 1 to 9 as true accounts, at least based on true stories, not myth that's been reworked to fit Israel's narrative. Now, it should be noted that various Mesopotamian myths, like the flood, which aren't necessarily isolated to Mesopotamia, by the way, can be used as evidence for the biblical account, not against it. The reason is because they serve as multiple attestation for the same event. So, like Noah's flood, if the Sumerians, Aztecs, and many other civilizations that were isolated, by the way, and they didn't have contact with each other, have a flood narrative, then instead of saying they all copied from each other, which wouldn't be possible, it would be wise to say that the story is multiply attested, and if it's multiply attested, then it's more likely to have happened. In a second, I'm going to go get my books. I'm going to show you the books that I'm going to use that help me know what the text is saying, and I hope we continue this conversation. Hello, so I actually moved locations because it's easier to get all my sources because they're already right here, and so I just moved locations. So the commentaries I'll be using is this one, or one of them is this one. It's a commentary by Gordon Wenham. Very good. I like it so far. The next one is Victor Hamilton's commentary on Genesis. And then I also have a whole lot of study Bibles. The one I really like, if I can grab it, is the ESV Study Bible. I have that one. It's the smaller one. I kind of want to get the bigger one with the little thing that I can put in there, or the string that I can mark my pages. But anyway, that's the one. That's the one I really like. Another one I really enjoy is this one, Ancient Faith Commentaries, or Ancient Faith Study Bible. I really like this one because I really like the early church fathers and what they had to say. So far, it's really good. I got a lot of information from it. Another commentary I'm using is Matthew Henry's. That's just to get some practical knowledge from it. And I like his commentaries. They're very good, too. I have two more commentaries. I'll get to them in a second. There's the ESV Archaeological Study Bible. Very, very nice looking. Not as good as... Actually, let me show you the Ancient Faith Study Bible. It looks so pretty. It's probably my favorite one that I have. It's this one. Highly recommend. Look at that gold. And then it even has the string, which I always love the string. It has two of them. One for New Testament, one for Old. So I would highly recommend that one. It's very good so far. Let's see. There we go. Let's see. We also got Craig Keener's and somebody else's who I don't remember. Cultural Background Study Bible. It's okay. It's not my favorite because they kind of take different views that I don't really hold, but it's not bad. Though I just started reading it, so I can't really say. Let's see if I can get it. There we go. The Apologetics Study Bible helps me with the historicity of things. This is a pretty nice cover too. Has the thinking man right there. Let's see, over here. And then the next one would be This was the John MacArthur. I think it's important to get various opinions from experts. Don't agree with him on a lot of things like Calvinism and stuff, but he is smart. He's been doing it for a long time, so I got his. I think I have Tony Evans. Is it in here? I don't know if it's in here. Oh, yes, it is. Okay, cool. I got the Tony Evans Study Bible. Once again, really smart guy. He's been doing it a long time. Don't fully agree with everything he says, but yeah, so nonetheless, that's another one. And then I also have the Ancient Christian there it is. I also got the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, Genesis 1 to 11. Really love that. That's a really good one. There's a lot in there too, because the early church they focused on Genesis, but they really focus on the first 11 chapters because there's so much good stuff in there. But nonetheless, that's my sources. That's what I'll be using, all of them, to help me understand. I also look a little bit at the Hebrew. I have the Halot, Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon for the Old Testament, or of the Old Testament. I have BDAG, which is the Greek New Testament, which I will use in the New Testament. I guess it's not relevant now. Also have the Septuagint by Brenton Lancelot, I think, which I'll be looking at that as I go through too, because I know Hebrew and Greek, and so I'll be using a lot of sources, and I really hope you'll help me continue this, and I hope that you'll benefit from me, and I hope I'll benefit from you, and let's do this together. So let's keep seeking so that we can keep finding, and let's do it together.